If you have a Bible and you find it helpful, please turn in it to 1 Samuel chapter 3. This is where we're going to spend our time today. I've said it to myself a lot in the past 30 years that I really wish I had, maybe I'm speaking stupidly, but it seems good to me, that I would have been an Old Testament person because everything just seems so clear to me in the Old Testament. You know, God did things, everybody knew it. If you messed up, God made it really apparent to you that you'd messed up. If you were doing well, God made it very clear that you were doing well. And it seems to me that there was a lot of certainty in a person's life who was a follower of God in the Old Testament. I mean, everything was very clear. Remember, they were at the foot of the mountain. They had the thunder and the lightning and everything going on up there when Moses was getting the commandments. I just wonder why it is that we don't have that today, why God doesn't make things as obvious as that today. I really wish He did. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, if you wish to follow along, and I'll begin reading in verse 10. The Lord came and stood by, calling Samuel as He previously had done. Samuel, Samuel. Samuel replied this time, "Speak, for your servant is listening." The Lord said to Samuel, "Look, I'm about to do something in Israel, and when anyone hears about it, their ears will tingle. On that day I'll carry out against Eli everything that I had spoken about his house from start to finish. You should tell him that I'm about to judge his house forever because of the sin that he knew about. For his sons were cursing God, and he didn't rebuke them. Therefore I swore an oath to the house of Eli. The sin of the house of Eli can never be forgiven by sacrifice or grain offering." So Samuel lay down until the morning. He opened the doors of the Lord's house, but Samuel was afraid to tell Eli about the vision. However, Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son?" Samuel said, "Here I am." Eli said, "What message did he speak to you? Don't conceal it from me. God will judge you severely if you don't tell me everything that God had said to you." So Samuel told him everything. He didn't hold anything back from him. And Eli said, "Well, then the Lord will do what He pleases." Samuel continued to grow, and the Lord was with him, and none of his prophecies fell to the ground unfulfilled. All of Israel from Dan to Beersheba realized that Samuel was confirmed as a prophet of the Lord. And then the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for it was in Shiloh that the Lord had revealed Himself to Samuel through the word of the Lord. I would like to have been Samuel. There's a lot to this backstory, and just to recount some of that for you so that this text we've just looked at makes more sense. Eli was the high priest, and his sons, Phinehas and Hophni, they didn't come from any baby book that I know of. I've never known a Hophni in my life until now. They both were doing terrible things. And they were doing it in the name of God. They were serving in the temple as they were the sons. That's how the priesthood was passed down, father to son. So here are these two sons serving in the temple. What were they doing? Well, they were taking advantage of the people who came to the temple to make their sacrifices. If they brought sacrificed a lamb, they would take the best cuts of the lamb for themselves and eat it. And if the person who brought the sacrifice had some questions about that, they'd say, "Look, we're servants of the Lord. You know, this is the way it is." They also took advantage of women because they were priests of the Lord and could do that. They could get away with it, they felt. So Eli didn't do anything about this for years. He let this go on. He knew about it. The text says, if you go back and read the backstory, Eli knew because he knew the people were reporting to him. They're saying, "Eli, do you know what your sons are doing? Here's what they're doing. What are you going to do about it?" And he did nothing. This just strikes me as such a modern thing. I mean, how many in the last month prominent Christian people have we seen fall? In the last month. Think of the thousands of people who listened to them, followed them, read their books, came to them in a way of saying, "You have a connection here to the truth of God that I want to be part of." only to see this whole thing going on in the background that nobody knew about come out. I mean, can you imagine if you're a person who heard the gospel through this person and became a believer that week, and then at the end of the week all this comes out? What would you think about what you'd heard? It's significant to me. I don't understand this, and this will be a question for me when I show up in God's presence. Why does He allow it to go on for so long before something comes of it? I don't know the answer to that. I'm going to say probably He's just being very, very patient with people, hoping that they'll turn from what they're doing. Seems to me, instead of worrying about why God allows it to go on so long, it seems smarter to me. I'm thinking now, maybe personally, it just seems a whole lot smarter to just say, okay, these are the things God would have me do. Maybe I just should obey that and not worry about why God is patient or not with all the things that shouldn't go on that He seems to put up with for so long. Well, Samuel, at this point in his trajectory, if you know the backstory, it's a very interesting backstory. His mother had prayed for a child. She was barren of children, and she prayed for a child. And God answered her prayer. And she said, if I have a child, if you'll give me a child, I'll dedicate that child to the Lord. And so that's why Samuel is living with the priest. He has been dedicated to the Lord. He's no longer living with his family. And she went on to have more children. So God answered her prayer directly, and Samuel is the firstborn who had been dedicated to the Lord. And so that's why he's where he is. Well, God waked him up 3 times. Twice, he just didn't know what was going on. He thought Eli was calling him from the other room, so he went in there and said, what do you want? Eli said, I didn't say anything. I've been asleep, just like you. Go back and go to sleep. He goes back to sleep. It happens again. Comes back. Eli, what's going on? Eli says, I didn't call you. You better go back and sleep. And he says, this is probably the Lord speaking to you. Maybe the next time you hear it, you should say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. And I noticed something very significant. When Samuel does respond, he doesn't say that. He just says, speak. He doesn't know what the Lord's voice sounds like. He's just a child. And God's been calling him. He thought it was Eli, and he's still not sure. He's not sure. He just says, speak, and I'll listen. You know, I want, and maybe you're of this same mindset, I want to be confident about God's calling always. I don't want to worry about whether or not this is what, and boy, I'll tell you, after 38 years of being a follower of Jesus, I can tell you it's not that easy. I wish it were. I wish it were just absolutely certain. This is what God's calling me to do, and that's what I'll do for any of us. But it's not the way it is right now. And then I look at what God does to Eli here, and I think, wow, that is sobering. I mean, Eli, God says, I'm going to punish your house forever. Wow. That's severe. And he says, there's no sacrifice left for you at the temple or your sons. I don't even know what that means. That's incredible to me. Why? I'm going to say this is because of the severity of what Eli allowed to happen and the severity of what these 2 boys had done. The severity is not only are you doing terrible things, but you're doing it in my name. You're doing it in my name. Now, the damage, who knows what the damage was for the people of Israel as they came and saw these things happening week in and week out. And they're thinking, I guess God's okay with it. This has been going on for a long time. I think it's important for you and for me, and I say this as one who this past week or 2 weeks ago was very much hurt by something I read of somebody that I have great respect for, whom I'll not name. We have to separate out 2 things. One is the person and the person being actually born again. That has to be separated out, because there's not a person in this room, myself included, who says I'm a follower of Jesus who does not sin. Nobody. And so I have to constantly remind myself that I have to separate out the sin from the sinner and the sin from the person who actually is a follower of Jesus, because we're all going to fail. Every one of us is going to fail. Paul says something very critical. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, all things are lawful for me, but not everything's good. Not everything's beneficial. That's true. And so when I look at Eli, what he was doing and the way in which he put up with his two sons, on a human level, it was lawful for him to do that, but it was not beneficial at all. And God judged it. Now, I don't know what that means for us in the New Testament era, but I'm going to guess and say, this kind of behavior God's still not happy with. I don't think anything's changed that way. And so when we engage in things that may seem lawful for us but are not beneficial in God's mind, we might ought to reflect on whether or not they are beneficial in God's mind as we perform those things that we think are okay. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're not okay. And is it better to be deprived of something we really, really want here to please God? That's a hard question to answer. I'll just leave that question out there for everybody to think about. What is the correction for this? There is a correction for this, and it's not necessarily that God gets out the smiting paddle and starts working us all over with the smiting paddle. It's not that necessarily. The correction for it is a repentant heart. Are our hearts repentant before the Lord? If Paul says, test yourselves to see if you are in the faith. Well, what's the test? Is it that I go to church? No. Is it that I read my Bible? No. That's not the test. What is the test? The test is whether or not we know we belong to Him or not. That is the test. And everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. If you have come to a place in your life where you've said, Lord, I've done wrong. Lord, I believe Jesus died on the cross for my sins and rose again on the third day. Come and forgive me for my sins and save me. The Bible says you're born again. We all know whether we've done that. Everybody knows that. Don't need me to remind us. Don't need me to beat that drum. We know it. And a person who has done that will have a repentant heart. Because the Spirit of God's not going to allow anything else. How do we get a repentant heart if we wonder about that? It's easy. Cry out to God for it. He'll grant it. If you and I want a repentant heart, all we've got to do is ask God to give it to us, and He will. So this speaks to me very loudly of the things that Phinehas and Hophni were engaged in, that they did not have a repentant heart at all. That's a frightening thing to me. I just, wow. And look at the contrast with Samuel. Samuel has this is amazing to me. Samuel has this experience wherein he hears from God in a spoken voice. Holy moly. I mean, what's that like? And what does he do when he wakes up the next morning? Text says he goes back opening the doors of the temple and just doing his normal duties. He goes back to his work, raking the leaves, whatever it is he had to do, and sweeping the floors. He just goes back to work. He doesn't suddenly start some worldwide ministry or show up for Israel and everybody recognizes who he is. No, he just goes back to his regular duties. The houseboy, that's what he essentially was, a houseboy. Wow. What a testimony of what it is to just simply belong to the Lord and go about the life of living consistently before God without making any show of ourselves whatsoever before the world. That is such a powerful testimony in my mind. That's simple. Are we satisfied in just belonging to God? Simply meeting and focusing on God. Think of our sitting here this morning, right? I remember a book, I was talking to a pastor 20 years ago. And I remember where I was standing in Walmart. Every conversation that has significance happens in Walmart at some time or another. I mean, because everybody's in Walmart. I'm standing there talking to this pastor. I have great respect for this guy, still do, love him. And I said to him, I said, we got into a conversation about the future of the church. And he says, I said to him, I said, you know what I think? I think that big churches, the mega churches, 10,000 members, they're going to do really well. I think that the really small churches, 20, 30 people, they're going to do really well. I think these churches in the middle are going to struggle. He looks at me, he says, have you read Simple Church? I said, no, I never even heard of it. So I went and got the book. I thought I'd better read it. What is Simple Church? It's what we do. It is. It's what we do. The first century church in the New Testament, what did they do? It says, if you read the Roman history of what the Roman writers said they saw the Christians doing, it says they get together on the first day of the week. And they got together really early. You know why that was? Because a lot of them had to work. So they got together before work. They sang hymns to Christ as though he were a god. They listened to some of the letters read, and they usually shared a meal. Well, we've got cookies and stuff back there. I guess that qualifies. And then they went back to their lives, and that was it. They did that once a week. That's what they did. That's Simple Church. And it doesn't have anything to do with the slickness of the presentation, doesn't have anything to do with a big screen and a PowerPoint and a great band or anything else. I just wonder about us in this century. Augustine said it in the 4th century, 1600 years ago. He said, God wants to give us something, but he can't because our hands are already full. Wow. I wonder if that's the case. God will meet us where we are. I don't have any doubt about that. That's why for me, to just say that and to leave that hanging there, I don't worry about it. Because I know that if a person comes to the Lord and asks for the Lord to meet with them, he will. I don't even worry about saying that with confidence. But what if we're so full that we don't have any needs to be met and we don't even notice when God meets with us? You see, a lot of people in our culture, because of the way our culture is, we look at God, people who say, I'm a follower of Jesus, will look at God as what's known in the business world as the golden parachute. You ever heard of the golden parachute? Ever heard that phrase? What that means is you bail out and you float safely to the ground in a parachute made of gold, so that when you float to the ground, everything's good. You've got all your needs are met. And that's the way we kind of look at God. We approach him when things are dire. And we're looking for the parachute. We're looking for God to bail us out of the things that are dire. But we're not thinking about him very much when things are good. Because don't really need to. Everything's good, right? There's a beauty, I think, in being desperate. I don't want to be desperate. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not looking. I'm not going to stand here and say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to be so desperate that God shows up in a big way? I don't want to be desperate. Maybe that's what's wrong with me. Look at the stories of every time God intervened. When did he intervene? There was nowhere else to turn. The Philistines are all around us. What are we going to do? I'm stepping out of we talked about it in Sunday school today. I'm stepping out of the boat, Lord, to walk on the water. Well, nobody walks on the water. But there's a certain desperation there. I mean, all the stories, think about, you go to the Christian bookstore and you pull up a book, self-help book, how to do this, how to do that. God will meet you here. God will do this. And you read the book, and what are most of the books comprised of? They're comprised of people who came to desperation and God showed up. And if you'll just do what they're doing, God will show up for you too. Well, maybe. Think about, look back and tie all this together and think about the garden. All right, the Garden of Eden. I don't care what any of us thinks about that in terms of history or not history. It doesn't matter to me. I think the lesson's the same. What happened? All their needs were met. They didn't have any need at all. God gave them just one rule. Don't eat that one. That was the only rule. He gave them the whole world. I can't even imagine what that's like. The whole world's yours. Just go ahead, be fruitful, multiply. It's all yours. But don't eat that one. And they did. And so they were banished from the place where all their needs were met forever. Why were they banished? You ever think about that? Why were they kicked out? Why not just say, okay, you did a really bad thing, but you know, I love you and I'm going to provide for you, so I'm going to leave you where you are. You just got to do better from now on. Why? Why were they kicked out of the garden? They were kicked out because they had fallen, they were damaged, and God couldn't allow them to eat from the tree of life and live forever in the damaged condition. There was a consequence. And then you look at the history of the Old Testament and you see Israel crest. They're following the Lord. Everything's going good. They slide away from God. That's what the word backslide. You know, that's where we get the word backslide. It comes from the Greek word apostasia, which means to slide back from, literally. It's like a metaphor. They slide back. God sends the Philistines, the Assyrians, and everybody else to come and punish them so that they'll come back. Why? Because he knows if they get desperate enough, they'll call out to God. That's all. Our history, I think, now think about this for yourself, is not our view of history our lifetime? Do we really think about what happened 200 years ago very carefully? I don't. Most of us just think about our history, our life. 60, 70 years, 40 years, 25 years, whatever it is. And it's hard for us to float in the history. Pretend the history is a great ocean of events. We're floating in it. It's very hard to rise up out of that to get a broad view of what's going on. I don't think it's possible for us. It is possible for God. He sees the big picture in a way that we do not. So when things happen in our lives, we come up with these questions. We say, where is God? Doesn't he see what's going on? Yes, he does see what's going on. But he's allowing us to be where we are for very specific reasons. Not for his pleasure in watching us struggle, I promise you. It's because there's a reason he allows us to struggle. Think about this. When a child is born, we all know about childbirth. Some of us more intimately than others. It seems almost absurd for me as a guy to comment on childbirth, but I'll do the best I can. When a child is born, things happen in the birth process, and they're very specific things that we don't consider. Have you ever seen or been around a woman who's had a child born by C-section?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you know why that is? What happens? What do? Once the child is removed, they immediately take the child and suction the child's lungs out. Do you know why they do that? Because the child didn't pass through the birth canal where the squeezing causes their lungs to be purged. The squeezing squeezes their lungs out naturally in being born. I just look at the world around me and I say, you know what? It's kind of like the distinction between a C-section and being born. We're being born. We're being squeezed. And it may come to the place wherein we're squeezed hard enough that we become desperate enough to say, Lord, I really, really need you. Things are happening all around us. They're happening to me. They're happening to you. They're happening to people we love. God knows about every one of them. But I don't think any of them are wasted. I think they're all for a purpose that God is saying, let me squeeze you just a little bit. It's going to be better for you that you're squeezed. I think that's what God's message is to us. He certainly squeezed Samuel. I don't know where everybody is today, but if you've got any questions about anything I've said,